All right, so Senator Bernard Sanders came out recently and slammed a new piece of legislation called the America Competes Act, which in theory is supposed to be this historic investment in domestic American manufacturing, specifically relating to microchips and semiconductors. But unfortunately, as we're about to hear from Bernie Sanders here, as it stands right now before amendments are introduced, it is essentially, as usual, just another slush fund for corporate America. So let's go ahead and get into some of the details here from Julia Rock of Lever News. She says Bernie takes aim at microchip company giveaways. So Senator Bernie Sanders has given his Senate colleagues and President Joe Biden an ultimatum on a proposed $53 billion giveaway to microchip companies. Hold a vote on amendments requiring the companies receiving the subsidies to spend them on domestic manufacturing, kind of the whole point of the bill, right? Or lose Sanders' vote, which is needed to move the bill forward quickly through unanimous consent. And they say Congress wants to buttress domestic semiconductor manufacturing in response to the pandemic-induced shortages. But as Sanders noted in a recent Senate speech, the highly profitable chip industry doesn't need the money. And he said, Mr. President, providing $53 billion in corporate welfare to an industry that has outsourced tens of thousands of jobs to low-wage countries and spent hundreds of billions of dollars on stock buybacks with no strings attached may make sense to some, but it doesn't make sense to me, Sanders said in his speech. And just to reiterate this point on stock buybacks, they say over the last decade, 5 U.S. semiconductor giants spent 70% of their profits manipulating their share prices through stock buybacks, the Lever previously reported. So we're going to get into a little bit more details in terms of their stock buybacks and the corruption surrounding that, but you understand the overall point that he's trying to make here, right? He's saying these are billion-dollar companies that have spent the last number of decades shipping their jobs overseas to exploit cheap labor abroad while destroying domestic jobs here in the United States. They've made billions and billions of dollars in profits, and instead of spending that on actual domestic, productive capabilities here in the United States, instead of investing that capital here in the United States to create jobs and ensure our supply chains are reinforced domestically, they've essentially just been using this on stock buybacks, which inflate their stock prices and are just a handout to shareholders and executives and etc. So it's just rank corruption. All the while, they've already been getting billions of dollars in subsidies from the U.S. government. So again, the question is, if you're going to give them $53 billion specifically to invest in domestic American manufacturing for semiconductors, then at least add an amendment to this that will guarantee that they're going to spend that money here in the United States to actually do the thing that this bill is supposed to fucking do, right? But apparently there are massive loopholes that exist in this legislation now that would basically allow these companies to do whatever the fuck they want with this money, and there are no guardrails in place that would actually force them to spend it on what apparently the whole point of the bill is in the first place. So a little bit more details on some of the history of this. They say, amid a spate of Biden-backed free trade deals between 1985 and 2014, the United States lost more than a third of its jobs in the semiconductor industry, even as the 5 major American-headquartered semiconductor companies raked in more than $9 billion of state and federal subsidies, loans, and other support, according to data compiled by the watchdog group Good Jobs First. So already nearly $10 billion in state and federal subsidies, still exporting those jobs overseas, still spending their money on stock buybacks. And they say much of the world's microchip production is now concentrated in Taiwan, which is the island that's obviously 100 miles off the coast of China, a major economic competitor on hostile terms with the island. And they say proponents of the CHIPS Act have cast their bill as a way to onshore some of that production capacity further away from the risk of the microchip supply chain being disrupted by any strife between the two countries. So you see the reasons, and they're somewhat just reasons, right? If you don't want China to have a monopoly on the semiconductor supply chain, which we're seeing the consequences right now with a shortage that we've been experiencing here in the United States, for obvious reasons, if you're an American, you don't want China to just have a monopoly on the production of this very valuable resource, right? We should be producing it here in the United States, creating good-paying union jobs to do so, and ensuring that we have our own domestic supply chains reinforced here, instead of just relying on what could be a chaotic situation, whether there's a pandemic or whether there's a military confrontation between Taiwan and China. We shouldn't be relying on those factors. We should be ramping up production here so that we can rely on ourselves. But They continue saying a little bit more history in terms of what Bernie previously tried to do before now reintroducing some of these amendments. They say, in order to ensure that this massive public subsidy is invested in domestic manufacturing, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced an amendment to give the government an equity stake in the companies receiving the subsidies and restrict companies that receive the subsidies from repurchasing their own stocks. Two things that are just so glaringly obvious it shouldn't even need to be said, right? Don't use the billions of dollars in federal or state subsidies on stock buybacks, which should be illegal anyways, but don't use it on stock buybacks and actually use it on the whole thing that this bill is designed to do in bolstering domestic manufacturing and also giving the government an equity stake in the companies, right? We shouldn't just be giving billion-dollar profitable corporations free money for nothing. No, we should give the American people via a government, right? A government purchase of their equity stake. We should give ourselves a direct stake in these companies as a reward for giving them billions of dollars from Americans, okay? It seems like a pretty fair trade-off here, but they say such repurchases of their stocks obviously inflate the stock prices of the companies, but don't go towards paying workers or investing in actual manufacturing. And they say, despite Senate Majority Chuck Schumer co-authoring a New York Times op-ed with Bernie demanding limits on stock buybacks, the Vermont senator's amendment was not added to the Senate Democrats' microchips legislation. So this is from way back in early March. And they say, instead, after Sanders' measure was blocked, a provision authored by Democratic Representatives AOC and Cori Bush was added to the House-passed version of the bill, but the language was touted by the Congressional Progressive Caucus and billed by Democrats as preventing companies from using any of the funds allocated in the CHIPS fund from being used on stock buybacks or the payment of individual shareholders. So this is what they said. This is what the Congressional Progressive Caucus, as well as other Democrats, as well as AOC and Cori Bush, they said that this was closing that loophole to ensure that they would actually spend it on domestic manufacturing. But look at how glaring this loophole that they provided actually was. So they say, however, the provision only prohibits companies from directly appropriating subsidy money to buybacks or dividends, and the language does not bar those companies from repurchasing stock or issuing dividends while simultaneously receiving the government funds, an important distinction because money is fungible. So in other words, if you didn't understand what this glaring gigantic hole of a loophole is here, they basically are saying, well, you can't use the billions of dollars we're about to hand to you directly on stock buybacks, but you can use other capital that you have at your disposal, and then just say you're not using it on stock buybacks and dividends to shareholders, right? So if money is fungible and there's no way to track whether or not the money we're giving them is being directly used on it, it doesn't matter if the money we're directly giving them is being used on the stock buybacks or dividends, because again, these are billion-dollar profitable companies that are already using their money on stock buybacks and dividends. So essentially, you would just be handing them free money to use on whatever the fuck they want with no guardrails in place to demand it's actually spent on domestic manufacturing, and they could basically just use this money to subsidize the other money and the other sources that they are using on stock buybacks and dividends. So it's just a massive loophole that's just like laughably ridiculous. So again, that's why Bernie Sanders is not putting up with the legislation as it stands right now and is trying to introduce some actual guardrails and some actual limits. But a little bit more perspective on how much and the scale at which they've been spending on stock buybacks just to inflate their stock prices. They say that Intel says that since 2005, its board authorized its executives to repurchase up to $110 billion worth of stock, of which $7.2 billion remained available. Okay, so over $100 billion just going towards stock buybacks since 2005. Not investing in domestic manufacturing, not investing in anything other than enriching their shareholders and executives, massively corrupt, not exactly the people I would be giving access to a $50 billion slush fund to. But they continue with a little bit more details here, saying separately, some companies have been pressuring Congress to pass the CHIPS Act through the Semiconductors in America Coalition. 4 of the group's members, Apple, Microsoft, Cisco, and Google, spent a combined $633 billion, okay, more than $500 billion on buybacks between just 2011 and 2020, more than 12 times the amount of subsidies the CHIPS Act would provide to different companies. So in other words, they don't even necessarily need this money in the first place. They should just be investing this money in domestic manufacturing instead of on enriching their shareholders. But of course, that's what they're going to do because these are capitalist enterprises that only care about maximizing short-term returns to their investors at the expense of the American people and at the expense of our entire economy. So you see exactly where their priorities are here. But finally, they say that Gelsinger, the Intel CEO whom Biden recently touted, recently pledged that his company, quote, would not be anywhere near as focused on buybacks going forward as we have in the past. So of course, you shouldn't believe them at face value. This is a CEO of a company that, again, has spent the last number of decades exporting jobs overseas to exploit cheap labor abroad while completely decimating the American manufacturing that we had here in place, as well as using billions of dollars, literally over $100 billion over the last number of decades on stock buybacks just to enrich their shareholders. So listen, at the end of the day, I would support, in theory, this type of legislation, right? I think we definitely should be investing heavily in American manufacturing, right? That's why I would support something like a Green New Deal that includes the creation of millions of good-paying union jobs in the renewable energy sector or in any number of other sectors in infrastructure and et cetera that are included under the scope of something like a Green New Deal. So we should be heavily investing in American manufacturing. I think everybody supports that, right? For so many different reasons. You want to create those good-paying union jobs. You want to create this capacity here in the United States so that we're not reliant on China or Taiwan or any other number of companies or countries on our supply chains for vitally important things like microchips and semiconductors. So for so many different reasons, you should support this legislation, but there's no fucking point in passing legislation like this if there aren't hard guardrails in place to ensure that these multinational billion-dollar corporations aren't just using this money on the same thing they've been using this money on for decades, again, stock buybacks and dividends for shareholders. So Bernie is 100% right on this legislation. If you're going to have them invest in American manufacturing, take an equity stake for the government so that we have a piece of these companies that is owned by the American people, even though our government is massively corrupt and you're not going to see a direct return on that, but ensure that there are guardrails in place that force them to actually spend 100% of this money on creating those jobs here in the United States and ramping up production here in the United States, and ban these companies, number one, from engaging in stock buybacks with the money we're giving them, but ban them from doing this at all, okay? This is part of the reason why capitalist enterprises have no incentive to invest domestically here in the United States, because why would they when they can legally just buy their own stocks, inflate their stock prices in order to maximize returns in a short-term way at the expense of the long-term economy and at the expense of the American people?